Okay, the parsha is named Noach. In Hebrew, Noah. I'm sorry, in English, it's Noah. After the protagonist of its major event, the Great Flood, it is found in Genesis chapter 6, verse 9. Okay. God instructs Noah, the only righteous man in the world consumed by violence and corruption, to build a large wooden teva, which is an ark, coated within and without with pitch. A great deluge, says God, will wipe out all life from the face of the earth, but the ark will float upon the water, sheltering Noah and his family, and 2 members, male and female, of each animal species, and 7 of the pure species, which later become known as the kosher animals. Rain falls for 40 days and nights, and the waters churn for 150 more days more before calming and beginning to recede. The ark settles on Mount Ararat, and Noach dispatches a raven and then a series of doves to see if the waters were abated from the face of the earth. When the ground dries completely, exactly 1 solar year, 365 days, after the onset of the flood, God commands Noach to exit the teva, to exit the ark, and repopulate the earth. Noah builds an altar and offers sacrifices to God. God swears never again to destroy all of mankind because of their deeds, and sets the rainbow as a testimony of his new covenant with man. God also commands Noach regarding the sacredness of life. Murder is deemed a capital offense, and while man is permitted to eat of the meat of animals, he is forbidden to eat flesh or blood taken from a living animal. Okay, so that's sort of the conclusion of the story of the flood, and then we have sort of an in-between story that connects. It's really the only story of Noah after the flood. So let's read it. Noah plants a vineyard and becomes drunk on its produce. 2 of Noah's sons, Shem and Japhet, are blessed for covering up their father's nakedness, while his 3rd son, Ham, is punished for taking advantage of his debasement. The descendants of Noach remain a single people with a single language and culture for 10 generations. Then they defy their creator by building a great tower to symbolize their own invincibility. God confuses their language so that one does not comprehend the tongue of the other, causing them to abandon their project and disperse across the face of the earth, splitting into 70 nations, otherwise known as the Tower of Babel, or Babel in Hebrew. The portion of Noach concludes with a chronology of the 10 generations from Noach to Abraham. Later, his name is changed to Abraham to Abraham. We'll read about that in the later portions. And the latter's journey from his birthplace, Ur Kasdim, to Haran on his way to the land of Canaan. So we start with Noach, and it starts sort of course, it's a sort of a depressing parsha in a way, the beginning at least, of great flood, the corruption of the earth, the great flood, but it ends maybe on a positive note. Well, Noach, certain stories of Noach are positive, but then you have Noach getting drunk, but it ends with Abraham and Sarah next week. That's certainly positive. So we start with a place of maybe less positive, but we end with a place of positivity. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in a nutshell. And there's a lot to talk about, a lot to think about, and hopefully a lot to apply. The only question is, as always, is where do we start from? Okay, so let's start a little bit with the, could always start with I guess some Hasidic inspiration. And that is based on the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. So just think about this for a second. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to sit here on a beautiful day. I mean, the sun is sort of trying to get out. Clouds are making comeback, so it's going back and forth. But we're trying to picture and think how these stories are relevant to us. So hopefully none of us experienced the flood in the physical sense. But in a way, it is a story that's relevant to us, maybe especially this year, because you talk about destruction, you talk about a flood, and you talk about having to rebuild after a flood. That's a very important component of the story that often does not get a lot of attention, right? How do you rebuild after the flood? And what are the challenges and maybe the failings as well? So if we're sitting here today thinking about how to rebuild, maybe that's more relevant to us. But from the Hasidic perspective, every portion in the Torah has a relevance on multiple levels, and it can be applied in many different ways. And what the Hasidic masters teach, beginning with the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, is that everybody in their own personal life experiences a flood. In other words, everybody in their own personal life experiences things that really are set out to drown them. In other words, you have your values, you have how you want to live, you have your perspective of how you want your day to go, but then there are things that get in the way. And it could be worries, it could be, objective concerns, it could be subjective, it really doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter what it is. The problem is that the worry and the concern, either of real problems or problems that are just, it's just fear and insecurity, but for the purpose of our discussion, it doesn't matter. What matters is that often we face waters and flood that want to drown us. And what the Hasidic masters teach is, if you want to look at the story, so Hebrew is a very interesting language, and words that are not connected in English are connected in Hebrew, and you get to certain insights that you would not get into the English. And one example is the word for teva, the word ark. God tells Noach to build an ark. An ark is an ark, it's a box. But the word ark also has another interpretation. The word ark, the word teva, also means, in biblical Hebrew, a teva is a word. So something can be, the same word means an ark, and it means a word. In other words, says the Baal Shem Tov, when God tells Noach, a flood is coming, and to protect yourself, you have to build, or you should build, an ark. Another way of putting it, and you have to enter the ark, and later you have to leave the ark, but that's another story. Another way of putting it is there are waves. There is rivers, or there is a flood. I just heard today, just 2 minutes ago. I don't always turn on the radio anymore because it's just too much of my blood pressure. But I just heard 2 seconds, and it said it's 12 years from Sandy today. So I guess that's the anniversary. So we're talking about a flood, literal flood, figurative flood. But if you're worried about this flood, these torrents of water, so what do? You have to go into the teva, which is the ark, but it's also go into the word. In other words, go into the words of prayer and study. And we're talking about a psychological refuge, right? Not just a physical refuge, but a psychological and spiritual refuge. And as a place where you create your own environment through your own words of prayer, words of study. And that, stage number one, that is going to protect you from the worries that are outside. That's step one. Okay, we understand it. That's from the Baal Shem Tov. 2 generations later, Rabbi Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, 2 generations later was the Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of Chabad, and he expounded upon this metaphor. And he said, if you want to look at this metaphor, and you want to look at the Torah describes at great length about how big the flood was and how much it was lifted off the earth and how long it was, all the details that seemingly are not that, don't seem so significant. But one interesting verse that the Torah emphasizes is that the waters, of course, it's going to float. We know the ark floats, but it talks about how the water lifts the ark up. And ultimately, the ark is the sort of the top, it's floating on top, because that's what arks do, they float. So if you want to talk about this in the spiritual sense, what comes out is a very fascinating concept. And that is that initially you went into the words, into the ark, and you went into the words of prayer and study because you were trying to create refuge and you were trying to protect your own, your sanity from the worries. But what turns out is the worries and the challenges actually elevate your prayer. Right? If the prayer and the study of Torah is the ark, and the water is the worries, real or imagined, that are distracting you. So you say, I feel overwhelmed. Let me take a few minutes a few minutes a day to pray. Let me take a few minutes a week to study Torah. So I'm entering the ark. I'm entering the words of Torah. I'm creating a protective environment. But what I don't realize is that maybe the worries elevate my prayer. In other words, if I did not worry, I would not pray with the same intensity. If I would not have this challenge in my life, then I wouldn't have to dig deep to find the spiritual resources to overcome it. And as a whole, my life would be on a lower level. Now I've been uplifted by the challenge. And that's a much deeper way of thinking about this, because what it turns out is, personally, I say I'd rather not have the worries. But that's at the outset. But truthfully, the worries and the challenges are actually going to elevate me to a higher spiritual state. And that's the way that's the Hasidic view of how this can be applicable to the story of the flood. On a basic level, could be applicable to each and every person. Rabbi Shneur Zalman continues, and as an example, he says, in amongst this community, there were different types of people. There were people most people were engaged in earning a living. They were business people and farmers, a little bit of farming, but mainly people in trade. And then there were people who were the scholars who would study Torah all week. So Rabbi Shneur Zalman in that discourse says, what happens is that the people who do engage in business all week, they don't have time to devote to study Torah, etc. And they're worried about the world, they're worried about the economy, worried about the stock market all week. So when it comes to Shabbat, they say we cannot pray with intensity, we can't meditate, we can't study the Hasidic teachings and internalize them, because we're not on the level of the people who all week are engaged in the study of Torah. But Rabbi Shneur Zalman says the opposite is true. If all week you're engaged in the study of Torah and you don't feel the waters of the flood, then your teva is not going to be uplifted. Your ark, you're not going to be lifted. And he says it's a mistake. He says the truth is the people who are engaged all week in the world now, when it comes Shabbat, they can pray and study Torah with greater intensity and with greater passion. So that's just an application of this idea where the challenge actually uplifts. So again, I would rather have no challenges because I'm looking for serenity. But we weren't created for serenity. You can have a little serenity in the world, that's okay. Shabbat is serenity. But we weren't created for serenity. We were created for growth. And the way to uplift the ark is a little bit of water. Now, you don't want the water to drown you. You have to know how to surf. You have to know how to create an ark. Okay, wonderful. So that's the creating the environment where you're protected. So that's a little bit just the beginning. So at least we know that what we're talking about here can apply in many different planes, including the spiritual sense. Now we can start opening up the parsha and analyzing what the Torah is trying to tell us about Noach and the twists and turns of the story. Go ahead.
So can you relate into this how had the pitch on the inside and on the outside? What is the symbolism?
Yeah, so you have to, in other words, Rashi contrasts this ark with the ark that we read about a few weeks ago on Sunday in the beginning of is it chapter 2 of Exodus, because there too there's an ark. The ark there, it's a smaller ark, but Moses is born, and there's a decree of the Pharaoh that he wants to kill all the Egyptians have to kill all males, or Hebrew males, but certainly all males, maybe all Hebrew males, but either way, Moses is a Hebrew male. So his mother puts him in a basket, and she puts pitch in the outside. And right away, the Medrash says, 1 second. It came to the ark, there's pitch on the inside and the outside. Right. It came to Moses' ark. It's a smaller ark, but it's an ark nonetheless. There's pitch only on the outside. So there's two answers. Now, so one answer is, well, if she doesn't want the baby to smell pitch, right? They come in there, it doesn't smell good. So you want a comfortable environment. Other answer is, there's a different story. It's not a flood, right? It's not a flood. The water is relatively calm. Yes, it's the Nile. Yes, it's the river, but she was placed sort of in the reeds at the side of the Nile, right? So he wasn't necessarily in the area where there's a very big, torrents of water. So you can read it out as a practical sense that the pitch is a protection on the inside or the outside. Spiritually, it means it has to be fortified, right? It's an effort, right? When you're praying, there's the worries that are coming and knocking on your door, and you have to make sure that no one breaks in. You have to be able to focus. That's kavanah, focus. There's a funny story. There's a funny story of one of the Hasidim, early Hasidim of I think it's the Maggid, who was the disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. And he comes to his teacher and he says, I forget all the names, I'm really bad at names and details, but the punchline stays the same. So he comes to his teacher and he says, I need you to help me. I need help with the technique of how to focus my thoughts, because I pray And all of a sudden, thoughts start coming in, and I start thinking about everything that happens, around the world. I don't know what's going on in the world, and I didn't have Twitter. But in any case, he was distracted by everything that's happening. You know the story, right? I told you the story. So, right? You know the story. So he goes to the Maggid. The Maggid said, you got to go to this chassid, he'll teach you. So he gets on his horse, he goes to that house, shows up in the middle of the night. It's not his fault. Comes in the middle of the night, every house is dark, of course. There's no cable TV. What are you going to do? The sun sets, you go to sleep. But then he sees there's one window, there's one house with a window, and the window, there's a candle, and his friend, his fellow disciple of the Maggid is sitting at the window studying. So he comes and starts banging on the door because it's freezing. And the guy's not opening up the door. And I could draw out the story for 20 minutes, but we don't have time. Bottom line is, after 20 minutes, the host opens the door. And at this point, the guest is shivering and he's so cold and he's so upset. He says, why didn't you let me in? Oh, no. So he lets him in, gives him tea, warms him up. So he says, stay here for a few weeks. So he says, so why didn't you let me in? He says, why did you come? So he says, I came because our teacher, the Maggid, said I should come to you to learn how not to keep my thoughts focused and not allow any other thought to enter. So he said, I told you that already. What did I teach you? That not everybody who knocks on the door do you have to open up. Right? So if you're the owner of the house, you decide who comes in, who comes out. That's the lesson. Not just because someone's knocking. I was a kid, the phone would ring, everyone would jump. We got to see who's on the phone. There's no caller ID. Who knows? Maybe it could be. And then the other attitude, not every time the phone rings, you have to jump. It's supper time. Right? So the point here is you're the owner, you're the balabait, you're the homeowner, you decide who comes in. So maybe that's the pitch, the putting on the pitch. It means you have to fortify the words of prayer and words of study. It takes focus, it takes effort maybe to practice, to get into it. But the bottom line is you create an environment, you create an arc for your spiritual sanity, for your spiritual health. And then it turns out, so on one hand, at the first stop, you're protecting yourself from the waters. But step number 2 is you're actually being elevated from the waters, because that contrast of having the worry and having the difficulty and having the challenge, and then understanding that you have to work harder to find spiritual meaning and spiritual purpose within that environment, that raises you and that elevates you, and that's step 1. Okay. Talking about words, I want to say a little bit more about words. Maybe we'll open up the screen and we'll show the words of the Parsha. Okay, so let's see if there's any Rashis here. Yeah. Okay, the following are the descendants of Noach. Noach was a righteous man. I don't know, will they change the translation here? They put a new translation into this without telling me. Okay, sometimes they do that. Okay. The following are the descendants of Noach. Noach was a righteous man. Here they say, faultless despite... I'm sorry, this is not a good translation. Tamim haya b'dorotav. He was wholesome or perfect, but he was wholesome in his generations. Noach walked with God. Now, what's interesting is, why do you have to tell me? It's not clear what the question is, but we already learned who Noach was. Last week's Parsha, the end of the portion of Bereshit, the first portion in the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, we have the chronology from Adam until Noach, including Noach. Noach was born, and talks about how everyone became corrupt except for Noach, and Noach finds favor in the eyes of the Lord, and that's how last Parsha continues. Now we have a new Parsha. These are the descendants of Noach. Noach was a righteous man, complete in his generations, or perfect in his generations, or faultless. The question is, we already know who he is, so why are you talking about, why are you mentioning him, why are you praising him in this context? So Rashi addresses that. Rashi says the following are the descendants of Noach. Noach was a righteous man. Since the verse mentions him, it relates his praise in accordance with what it says. The mention of a righteous person is for a blessing. That's the first interpretation. What is Rashi telling us? Rashi's telling us that, look, if you want, the Torah just wants to tell us just to mention Noach. These are the descendants of Noach. Once you mention the name of the righteous, you should talk about it and praise the righteous. Why? As the verse says, the mention of a righteous person is for a blessing. That's the conventional reading. The spiritual reading is that we talked about Teva, the ark, as in words, and we talked about words also in the beginning of the parsha of the Torah last week, when we talked about how God creates the world with words. And what the Hasidic masters teach is that it's not that if you talk about a righteous person, you praise him. It works the other way around. If you want someone to be righteous, you have to praise them. In other words, speech has even just speech on a very basic level. What is speech? Speech is you express an idea that's hidden within yourself. So you have this potential within yourself. When you speak it, you express it. So the Kabbalists explain that when you speak about something, that has the ability to bring it into the world. So the words you use to describe the environment actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy and create that environment. So God creates the world through speech. We also create the world through speech, through our own world. We create our own world and our own environment through speech. And the Torah is telling us, oh, you want to be right? You want to be Noach? You want to be righteous? You have to mention the praise, talk about the praise, and sort of help that come into fruition. And that's a lesson also about how God is speaking to Noach and talking about him and praising him. We'll see later, not the full praise, but praising him. And that is an important step in creating the positive environment, just like the concept of the Teva itself, the word itself, is the power, represents the power of speech. So that's the first point. And then we talk about this, Noach has 3 sons. The earth becomes corrupt. And basically God tells Noach that you have to build an ark, and I'm bringing a flood. And what happens, this is a relatively famous teaching. Many people heard this before. It says Noach was righteous in his generations. I'm looking at the first verse of the Parsha, B'dor Atap, in his generations. Noach was a righteous man, faultless in his generations. So why do you have to say he was perfect or wholesome or faultless in his generations? What is that addition? In his generations, what does that do? What's the intention of that? Right? It's a modifier. But what is it doing? Is it making it better? Is it making it worse? Right? So you know the teaching. There's 2 interpretations. Rashi offers us 2 interpretations. Some people say it's for the positive. Some people say it's for the negative. How so? Some people say it's for the positive. So let's read Rashi inside. In his generation, some of our sages explain this to his credit. He was righteous even in his generation. If he had been in a generation of righteous people, he would certainly have been more righteous. But others explain this to his discredit. He was a righteous person only in comparison with his own generation. But had he had been in the generation of Abraham, he would not have been considered of any importance. In other words, the Torah says he's righteous in his generation. What does that mean? Well, we know his generation, they were all wicked. So to be righteous in the generation of Noach is not so difficult, right? So that's when you read it to the discredit. If you want to read it to the credit, is even though in his generation he had no one to learn from, and everybody was corrupt, and yet he remained righteous, that is a very difficult thing to do. If you have other righteous people who are your friends, if you have a good neighbor, if you have a good teacher, if you have a good spouse, okay, so you have other people who can help you. That's not as big a great a deal. Had he been in a generation of Abraham, he would be even greater. So these are the 2 interpretations, which is very nice. The Hasidic interpretation takes us a step further and says, 1 second. Let's say now we have 2 ways to learn. We have 2 ways to look at Noach. We could look at Noach at the positive, or we could look at Noach as the negative. In other words, we could look at this as positive or negative. So what would be the motivation to choose and say of the rabbis who say that, no, it's here, this verse is telling you, it wants to express his discredit, right? What would be the purpose of saying that? And you could say for the positive, say it's to his credit. Why say to his discredit? Obviously, we have some agenda here that we want to say this is Noach is less than perfect. Noach's personality is problematic. So the Rebbe's interpretation is as follows. Noach himself is not problematic. Both interpretations could be true. In other words, in comparison to his generation, he was righteous. In comparison to Abraham, he was not righteous. That's an objective fact. That's not a question of that's not a debate. That's an objective fact. The question is, what's the takeaway? What does the Torah want you to learn from him? And here there's 2 interpretations that the Torah could say. Number 1, take the praise, understand the praise, that even someone not as great as Noah, even someone like Noach, who's not perfectly righteous, he's only righteous compared to his generations, even he could save the world. In other words, what we're saying is, what's beautiful about Noach is that he was not extraordinary. He was not an Abraham. He was a regular person with regular talents. It's just that everyone around him was corrupt. And what he did was, his only quality was, he does not give in to peer pressure. But you don't have to be extraordinary to be a Noach. And that's the takeaway. According to the people who want to say, the most important takeaway is that read this verse as a positive. It's to his credit, because we want to tell you that the takeaway of Noach is he's not extraordinary. But take away the fact. But the point is that means that anyone could be a Noach, right? Because if Noach is this extraordinary person, not everyone could be a Noach, right? But if Noach is an ordinary person, anybody could be someone who would save the world. In other words, has the ability to withstand the peer pressure of the society and the corruption of society. So that's if you want to read it for the positive. If you want to read it for the negative, it's not that Noach is bad, but the model of Noach is bad. And this became famous because the Zohar talks about this, and many people have probably heard it. And the Zohar talks about how the fact that one of the ways, when you read the book of Genesis, which is our history, you could see certain trends developing. And the Torah doesn't necessarily tell us exactly what the purpose of these stories are. We have to learn from the stories that we know, but what are the takeaway messages? It's not always clear. So there's obviously obvious messages, and there are hidden messages. And some of the hidden messages, you can't look at one story in isolation. You have to look at the development of the stories to see how the characters of people are developing and growing from the previous stories to the later stories. And the Zohar makes the point that if you look at Noach, and you look at Abraham, and you look at Moses, you will see how they evolve. And Noach is the starting point, which is the most negative. Noach does not pray for his generation. God comes and says, make an ark. He says, why? He says, because I'm bringing a flood to kill everybody. So what should he say? Please don't bring a flood. But Noach doesn't do that. He executes exactly what Hashem does. He makes the ark, collects all the animals, and the Torah says multiple times, Noach did whatever God commanded, precisely what God commanded him. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? You can read it as a wonderful thing, but the Zohar reads it as a critique. He did exactly what God told him. What didn't he do? He didn't pray to God. He didn't argue with God. Who argues with God? Abraham. When it comes to Abraham and God, in the next story, next parsha, when God, well, it's 2 parshas from now, but when God comes to Abraham and says, I'm about to destroy the wicked city of Sodom, what does Abraham say? He argues with God, and he says, save the wicked people of Sodom on account of the righteous people in Sodom, the few righteous people. Just a second. The problem was there were no righteous people, so nobody was saved except for Lot and his family. Then you get to Moshe, which is the further development of the story, of the character trait. And what happens with Moshe? Moshe, when the Jewish people sin, Moshe tells God, forgive the sinners, not forgive the sinners on account of the righteous, because that doesn't always work. Moshe says, forgive the sinners. So you see that there's a development. In other words, when the rabbis are reading Noach, and the verse says he was righteous in his generations, the rabbis say, stop 1 second. Don't read this as positive, because if you read this as positive, you may take a lesson from Noach, which is basically protect yourself and not care about your neighbors. So that's why we say, for him, that was all he can do. That's all that can be expected of him because of where he was in that situation. But for us, we have the benefit of the Torah. We have the benefit of the stories and understanding the full view. Noach was not the perfect model. The perfect model is somebody who would be concerned about their generations. So that's why we want to look at this. That's why the rabbis, some of them look at this verse as saying something to Noach's discredit, not because we want to put down Noach, because for Noach, that's the most that can be expected of him. But so we understand that there's a model that's more advanced than the model of Noach.
Right. So, but Noah is actually kind of like Abraham with the Akedah then.
Correct. So that's a question. That's another question of how come Abraham. That's really a question about Abraham. Really a question of the binding of Isaac. How come? I think what you're alluding to is that when God tells Abraham to offer his son, he doesn't protest, right? Okay, so that's a good question. That's a good question of why he doesn't protest. But I don't know the answer to the question. Where I think what I come from is that from Abraham's perspective, mistaken or not is a different question. But from Abraham's perspective, offering a child to God was a positive. In other words, if that's what God wants, it's the will of God. That's okay. Here, God is saying, let's punish the people because they're wicked. So if it's to punish the people, there are other ways to deal with the punishers, with the wicked. You can get them to repent, right? So the point here is, it's not only that he argued with God, it's he didn't do anything. Noach, you think about Noach. Noach had a there's a medrash. It's either literally or not, doesn't really matter. But the medrash says it took him 120 years to build the ark. So the medrash says it's not so bad because over his career he lived for 900 years, 930 years, I think. No, a little less. I forget how many years he lived, but he lived over 900 years. So 120, he built his ark. Why do you have to build 120 years in an ark? So God told you to do it. Go to Home Depot and build the ark. So the one answer is no. God told him, you do this. So what? So you build the ark. What do you start? Don't buy the raw material from somebody else because then he's building your ark. So the first thing you do is you start planting the trees. So then it takes, say, 80 years till they grow. But the point here is, if you take it literally or not, the point is that it took a very long time to build the ark, even if he built it alone. And the Medrash says, why? God couldn't find some other way. Took Noach, put him on top of the Himalaya, put him on top of the Everest, and everyone else would drown. The point here is, according to Noach, according to God, he wanted people to come he wanted people to ask Noach, why are you building the ark? And he wanted Noach to tell them the flood is coming and influence them. Now, years passed, and Noach did not find one soul that he could convert to righteousness. You're going to get one guy to say, you know what, I'm going to repent and I'm going to join you on the ark, right? So this guy's so forget about arguing with God. This is an acceptance of the state of the wickedness of people, and no intention to try to change that. So that's Noach's model. Yeah.
But it says something about his generation that when they saw him constructing an ark over many, many years.
I think he's a crazy.
But maybe some who were saying, maybe we need to hedge our bets
But nobody did. Nobody did because it's so extraordinary. Nobody did. And there's all kinds of things to get into the psychology of Noach and why Noach didn't speak to his generation. So there's an interesting teaching. I think it's interesting. The Medrash talks about this. Rashi quotes it, but then the Hasidic interpretation sort of puts another angle on it. So we have three layers. We have the verse, you have the Medrash, and you have the Hasidic interpretation. The verse says, a very interesting verse. The verse says that, let me show it to you. Why not? I don't have to say it by heart. You don't have to trust me. Hide the Rashi first. Okay. The verse says, I'm looking at chapter, I don't even know. I'm looking at chapter 7, verse 7. So this is after, he does everything that God says. He builds the ark, he gathers all the animals, they enter the ark, everything is fine. And all of a sudden, we reach verse 7. You could share with me. Noach, together with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives, came into the ark. Don't worry about this. This is not the bold. Mipnei, from before the water of the flood. Basically, to protect themselves against the water of the flood. Says Rashi. Rashi points out that what it says, he came because of the water of the flood. You know what it means? It means God says go into the ark. He says, no, I'm not going into the ark. He waited for it to start raining. When it starts raining and it starts accumulating, then he goes into the ark. Is that a positive or a negative? Sounds like it's a negative. He doesn't have faith. Even Noach himself doesn't believe the water is going to come. So that what does Rashi say? No, even Noach was lacking in faith. He wavered in his belief that the flood would come and did not enter the ark until the water forced him to do so. In Hebrew, Noach miktane amana. Noach has a little faith. His faith was small. So you could read this negative. Hasidic masters say it's not negative, it's positive. Noach doesn't believe in himself. Well, it's not positive. It comes from a place of humility. We're talking about on Sunday also. Moses' humility. The problems with the great people is their humility. Noach is a humble man, but he doesn't have faith. Not that he doesn't have faith in God. Of course he has faith in God. If not, he wouldn't spend all those years building the ark. Noach doesn't have faith in self. Now that expresses itself in two ways. Number one, he doesn't think he could persuade other people to join his perspective. In other words, to repent. He doesn't think he can influence other people. That's one area where he lacks faith. Another thing, he lacks faith in himself. He doesn't think God is going to save him. He doesn't think he's worthy of being saved. And therefore, he thinks God is going to have no choice but to cancel the plan of bringing the flood. Because the plan is predicated on saving somebody. But Noach says, but I'm not worthy of it. So it's not going to happen. But either way you look at it, you could see that Noach's problem is a problem of not believing in his power and his ability to A, be saved, and B, save others. So that is a little bit about Noach's personality and the lead up to the flood. We don't have a lot of time left. We have 19 minutes left. I really want to talk about some of the stories that are post the flood, because in a way it talks about the changes in the world and how do you react to this terrible situation where everybody becomes corrupt. And in a way, it's a tremendous failing, because God creates the world and there's a failing. God says I have to wipe it all out, I have to start again. And then all of a sudden we start again. And then what's interesting, probably the most interesting thing that happens is God says, the first thing after the flood, Noach offers offerings. God says, oh, no more floods. 1 second. If no more floods, if floods are a bad idea after the flood, so how come God didn't think about this before the flood? Right? So we have to deal with it. Something happened, something changed. There's an ability to find comfort, there's ability to rebuild after the destruction and corruption of the world. And what messages is the Torah telling us? That's what we're going to have to look for in the next few minutes, God willing, with God's help.
Is Noah a little bit like Lot?
In what sense?
He's like adjacent to greatness, but he's not great.
Yeah, except that there's no one else to be adjacent to. So he's not relying on anybody else. He's relying on self. In a way, Noach is the model of the person who's not influenced by the society, people around them, which is very difficult to do. Right? Maimonides talks about how, this is before psychology, but Maimonides has this insight, and he says that a person is Medina, a person is a social being. A person is a social animal. It's very difficult not to be influenced from your surroundings. And that's why the sages teach that it's very important to surround yourself with positive people. Everyone knows people that they're just negative and they just drain you of positivity. You say, what's the problem? I'm a healthy person. I could be around negative people. It doesn't really work that way, because we are affected by the people around us. So Noach has this extraordinary ability of not to be affected. Lot, I wouldn't say that. Lot is affected. He's first affected by Abraham, and that's why he's relatively good. And when he goes to the people of Sodom, he's affected by their negativity. But then a little bit of Abraham's influence is still upon him, and therefore he invites the guests, right? But the point is, Noach is in a way, Noach is, to the contrary, Noach has nobody to rely on. He's in a way, he's self-reliant. So in that sense, it's laudable. The problem is that it's only self, right? That he's only defending himself, not trying to influence others. And in a way, he's got three sons. He's got 3 sons, but that's his own. That's your own family. What about somebody else? What about the neighbor? What about someone beyond your immediate family? Could you think about other people? Now, practically speaking, it may have been easier for him. He didn't necessarily realize that. In a way, the best way not to be influenced is to influence. Right? In a way.
But then you get into dialogue, and it's
dialogue is dangerous, right? Dialogue is dangerous, but the Hasidim have a thing that a Chassid, you have to create an environment. You can't be alone. It's very hard to be a Jew alone.
But Chabad sends shaliachs all around the world to empty places.
No, but to create an environment, to create a community.
But they go to an empty place.
But the goal is not to remain empty. The goal is not to say I'm perfect and everybody else is corrupt. No, the goal is, could we create community? Could we interact with each other? Could we create an environment where people want to get together for holy and good things? Right? So that's not the Noach model. That's not that everyone else is sinning. I'm just saying, but the model, the concept that in Hasidic life, you can't, Judaism in general, you can't really do things alone. You have to have a minyan. You have to pray with 10 people. But even more with Hasidic life, it's understood that if you really want to connect to God, you have to also connect to other people. And we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about that as the aftermath. Okay, a lot more to do. Only a few minutes left, but we'll try our best to keep this interesting. Comments, questions. If I'm saying things you know or you don't know, or as interesting or not interesting, please let me know. On Sunday, I thought I gave a very good class to the kids in Hebrew school, and I said, "Was it interesting?" And one girl says, "No, it wasn't interesting." So the girl sitting next to her said, "Oh, that's so rude." And I said, "No, she's being honest. That's exactly what she's supposed to be doing. So if I'm being boring, please don't be polite, but be honest." Okay, what are we looking for? Oh, a little bit more we have to talk about. So much to say, so much to say. Okay.
Is there a lot of drunkenness in the Torah when I think about it?
No,
Not really, right?
no, there's only one drunkenness, which is this story that I
Really?
think of. Yeah, where people got drunk in the 5 books of Moses. Yeah,
Or even in the Tanakh.
and not, yeah, Tanakh maybe a little bit more, maybe. So Noach is good. And we'll talk about the, hopefully we'll talk about the drunkenness as well.
What is the symbol of the rainbow?
Talk about the rainbow. Talk about the rainbow. Talk about the rainbow. Okay, I'm going to try to talk about the rainbow and the covenant. I'm going to try to talk about a few things together. I'm going to try to talk about a few things together. Okay. One of the tricks where you could learn some meaning, or one of the ways where you could get some meaning from the Torah without looking at the hidden messages, is when you look at one verse and you see the same verse appearing in two different stories, but it appears in different contexts. And that's how perhaps you could see how the Torah is maybe emphasizing something different as a result of what's happening in this story. Case in point, we're going to talk about a very important verse that appears both last week's parsha, first portion of Genesis, and this week's parsha, the second portion of Genesis, the story of Noah. And that is the story of B'Tselem Elokim Asata Adam, man created in the image of God. Not sure exactly what that means because of different commentaries and commentators offer different commentaries about what exactly does that mean. How could we be created in the image of God if God has no image? But let's put that question aside. Man is created in the image of God. Something within the human being is related to the image of God, and therefore human life has value and has dignity no matter what. Okay. So that story appears in the creation of Adam and Eve. It appears again in this week's parsha. What happens after this week's parsha? What happens after the flood? So right after the flood, God tells Noach to leave the ark. God spoke to Noach saying, I'm looking at Genesis chapter 8, verse 15. God spoke to Noach saying, leave the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives and your animals, etc. So Noach goes out. Noach builds an offering to Hashem, that's or builds an altar, that's verse 20. Verse 21, God, and offers offerings. Verse 21, God smells the aroma of the offerings and he says, wow, this is unbelievable. I'm never again going to bring a flood. What exactly that means? I don't think we'll have time to get into that today. But the bottom line, he says things are going to stay the same. All the seasons are going to stay the same. We don't want any change. And then he gives them a blessing to be fruitful and multiply, again, like he gave to Adam and Eve. And then he makes a change. Verse 3. He says, now they can also eat meat. Up to that point, Adam was only allowed to eat. Adam and his descendants were only allowed to eat vegetation. Now he says you can eat kol remesh, any creature, any moving creature. Every moving creature that lives will be yours to eat. Like plant vegetation, I have now given you everything. But nevertheless, you may not eat the flesh of a still living creature, nor its blood. In other words, while an animal is alive, you can't take a limb and eat it. That is one of the 7 Noahide laws, the 7th one. There used to be 6 to Adam, and the 7th universal law is basically cruelty, not to be cruel to animals. But the technical law is that you can't take a limb of the animal and eat it while it's still alive. Now you say, why would anyone want to do it? Well, in the ancient world, it probably had a good idea because you had no refrigeration. So you take a piece of meat today, take a piece of meat tomorrow, keep it fresh, keep it alive. But that's something that the Torah says explicitly you're not allowed to do. Okay, but now all of a sudden, now that you can kill animals, Torah has to reiterate and says, "Oh, but you can't kill people." Okay, right? So that's what he says, verse 5. Verse 5. Nevertheless, I will settle the account of blood you shed if you take your own lives, like committing suicide. Okay, I can't read this translation. I will settle the account from the hand of every wild beast. I will settle an account of human life from someone, their own brother. I'm going to open up an article. But the bottom line here is, he says, even though you can kill animals, you cannot kill people. And if you kill another person, then God will avenge the blood. That's essentially what's happening here. If you want to see the verse is, I'm reading on the article, it's page 41, chapter 9, verse 5. Read it again. However, your blood with which belongs to your souls, I will demand. Of every beast will I demand it, but of every man, for that of his brother, I will demand the soul of man. Verse 6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God he made man. Ki b'tselem Elokim asata Adam. So this verse is familiar, right? We had it last week in the creation of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve are created in the image of God. And here we say, if you kill somebody else, then you should be killed. Why? Because in the image of God, he made man, meaning a person is created in the image of God, and therefore human life has infinite value or dignity, call it what you want. What happened here? What is the corruption? Corruption of the flood was primarily Hamas robbery. That's the Hebrew word, Hamas. It's interesting. So basically, the Torah describes the situation where there is no, the whole entire earth is filled with robbery. Malah ha'aretz Hamas, full of robbery. In other words, there is no respect for other people's dignity, other people's property. That was the cause of the flood. You know, if people serve idols, we'll see later. Okay, it's later in the story. God will not destroy a society where people serve idols, which is considered in some sense the worst sin. But what societies will lead to destruction? That's the society where people cannot get along. And the basic thing is, if the whole earth is full of robbery, where people do not respect other people's private property. Okay, that's the cause of the flood. How do you protect against the flood? What's the first message God says when they come out of the flood, out of the ark? So later we'll talk about the rainbow. The rainbow is going to happen in a second, and we'll tie that in. We'll get to the rainbow. But even before the rainbow, the first thing God says, okay, you can eat the animals. Why that is another whole discussion. I can't get into that. Maybe at 1 o'clock, but not before 1. We only have 6 minutes left. But the first thing God says, if you kill somebody else, in other words, put it this way. In a way, when I think about to protect against the corruption of the earth, you have to realize not that you were created in the image of God. That we learned in Genesis. That your friend was created in the image of God. That's going to protect against the corruption. In other words, seeing God in another person. Because where does corruption start? Corruption starts where there's me against the other person. The other person's in the other group, in the other family, in the other tribe. So I can take from them because I want their resources, etc. Where are you going to solve that problem of corruption? Where are you going to be? Where could you create peace between human beings? So the fact that I was created in the image of God is easy. Every group says, "Oh, we're special, we're chosen, we're special." Fine. But God says after the flood, you have to see the dignity in the other person. You have to see that the other person was created in the image of God. If you can see that, then you're going to protect against the flood, the corruption that led to the flood. Let me see if I can try to connect that into the rainbow, and maybe that will clarify. So God says, no longer am I going to bring a flood. Why? Because Noach brought a few offerings. How does that help? Nobody knows. Okay, but we'll talk about that in a second. So God says, I'm going to have a rainbow. And the rainbow was a sign that no longer will I bring the flood again. Meaning, even when I want to bring the flood, the rainbow will remind me not to bring the flood. Now, all the commentaries want to know what happened with the rainbow. Like what is the rainbow emphasis? Like what does the rainbow do? What's the symbolism? What is it symbolizing? So there are different interpretations. One interpretation is that, I think it's from Nachmanides, and other people say it as well, that the rainbow, the bow is sort of a bow and arrow where you would shoot somebody or a sign of destruction. But what happens is a sign of peace. What do you do when you want to show peace and you see the other person and you want to show that you're not here for war? What do you do with your rainbow? You turn it toward yourself. So rainbow, at least some of them, at least most of them, or some of them, at least where they make the pictures in preschool, the rainbow starts with the earth and comes back with the earth. So in other words, God is painting the arrow towards self. So it's a symbol of peace. That's what the rainbow is. That's on a basic level. But if you look at it that way, it's just a sign of peace to remind God that he shouldn't destroy the world, but it's not telling you why God would not want to destroy the world. So we have to try to look for maybe the rainbow is also telling us why God should no longer destroy the world. So there are multiple interpretations. I'm going to take one for Rabbi Shamshon Falhirsch, and he says like this. What happened? And he says this ties in later to the story of the Tower of Babel, which is also one of the most cryptic stories of the Torah. People want to be united. God says, no way are people going to be united. We must disperse them. What's so terrible if people want to be united? So the classic commentaries say, oh, because they wanted to fight God. What a wonderful interpretation. The only problem with that interpretation is it's not what the verse says. The verse makes no allusion to any sin. That's all, no allusion. It just says they wanted to be united. They wanted to build a big tower going to heaven. It doesn't say that they want to make a name for themselves. It doesn't say anything that they wanted to sin. So how do we deal with this? What's the rainbow and what is the Tower of Babel? So one way to think about it like this: you have to protect against the corruption of all of humanity, because the entire humanity, the entire society becomes corrupt. So the old model was bring a flood because they're all united, everyone becomes corrupt. Now we say, you know what? God says we can avoid the need for a flood by avoiding the possibility of the entire humanity becoming corrupt. How so? By creating, I'm going to say a dirty word, but not a dirty word, but I'm saying we're going to create different nations, right? Different nationalities. How does that help us? Because if once one part of society becomes corrupt, the other, in other words, every part of society has a certain value. Nobody has the absolute truth and nobody has absolute corruption. And if one segment of society becomes absolutely corrupt, the other segments of society will protect against it and will fight back and defend all of society against that corruption. So in other words, the unity is actually dangerous because the unity allows that a charismatic person can unite everybody for corruption. And that's what happened before the flood. What does the rainbow represent? The rainbow represents multiple colors. Rainbow represents that what's going to protect the world against the corruption is the fact that our society, that our culture is multicultural. That's the protection. And in a way, that's what we're trying to do later with the tree of knowledge, with the dividing of the cultures, and that's going to protect against the need for another flood. And that's the dispersion of all the nations. Okay, I have 1 minute left. I'm going to say one last thing, and this maybe is the most positive. I didn't have time to talk about the story of Noach getting drunk, even though it's a very important story. So I'm going to talk about it from a different angle, just so sort of very briefly. And one way to think about this again is to compare it to the story of the Garden of Eden, because there are certain similarities between the story of the Garden of Eden and the story of Noach getting drunk. The basic story. So we read the basic story in a nutshell. So what are the similarities? The similarities are that both stories of the Garden of Eden and the flood here and the Noach getting drunk, there's a shortcoming. There is a blessing and a curse in both stories. Right here, Noach curses his son, his grandson. The solution to the problem, both is a solution to the problem. Both of those stories have a garment related to the solution of the problem. Right here, Adam and Eve, when they sin, they realize they're naked. God brings them garments. Here, who brings the garments to Noach? Noach's children. And there are many other similarities between these two stories. Even the opening story, God planted a garden in Eden. Here, Noach planted a vineyard. Right, the opening story. So there's many similarities. So what's the takeaway? Takeaway is like this: what happens after the flood? And you could see this earlier also. I didn't emphasize this. The big change after the flood is that the human being is called upon to take responsibility. In the story of the Garden of Eden, God plants the garden. God is the one who blesses the human being. God is the one who curses the snake and the earth when they sin. God is the one who helps Adam and Eve after they sin. Adam and Eve are very passive. All they do is sin, but essentially they're very passive. Post-flood, what happens, and this is the comfort, maybe we're not as great as God in creating a Garden of Eden, but the inspiration is that the human being is able to start correcting themselves. And that's why the fact that Noach could bless Till now, no, people didn't think they could bless. They think God blesses. No, you could bless. If you see an injustice or you see someone in a state of humiliation, you can protect them. You can cover them. You can heal them. And that's the big change in the story. And that's where the comfort comes. So in other words, in the first portion of the Torah, the human being is relatively passive. In this story, the human being is much more active. You see that in the flood as well, because again, the flood story itself mirrors the story of creation in many ways, how the Torah describes the flood or the rebirth after the flood. First, everything is covered in water. Then the mountain emerges. Then he sends out birds. That's like the fifth day of creation of the birds. And only then does the human being emerge. And only then and then God blesses them again. So it's almost like a recreation story. The difference would be that in the first creation story, man is absolutely passive. And in this creation story, Noach is active. So in other words, now we understand that if the world is not going to be destroyed and if the world is going to last, it's because the human being is invested and involved and hopefully will elevate and heal. So that's the story in short, a lot more to say, but I'm already 2 minutes late, so we'll stop here. Everyone should have a wonderful day and we should meet each other in good health. Comments and questions and objections are welcome. Everyone should have a wonderful day. Thank you all for joining.
Yes, cool.
Thank you.